Good morning, everyone. This is the Vermont House Committee on Commerce and Economic Development. It is Friday, January 31st, 2025 at 10:10 in the morning. We are going to continue our morning with an introduction to Common Good Vermont. Emma, if you'd like to join us, thank you for coming in this morning.
Thank you so much for having me. Great to be here. Hi, everyone. I'm Emma Paradise. I'm Manager of Policy and Strategic Initiatives at Common Good Vermont. And I do have a presentation today, so I'll just go ahead and share my screen.
So maybe I'll ask the committee to introduce themselves to you, so you know, put a face with the name.
I know, so many new folks this year.
Yeah, I'm Jonathan Cooper. I live in Pownell, the southwestern corner of the state. The Bennington district includes Volca Pownell, Reedsboro, Searsburg, Woodford, and Stanford.
Emily Karras Duncan. I'm Jonathan's neighbor. I represent Wilmington, Whitingham, and Halifax.
Herb Olson, representing Bristol, Lincoln, Moncton, and Starkville.
I'm Abby Duke. I represent parts of Wilmington.
Hi, Edie Granny, representing Jericho and Underhill, and the vice chair of the committee.
And Mike Marcotte from Coventry, represent Coventry, Irisburg, Newport Town, Troy J. Westfield, Lowell, and Eaton, and chair of the committee.
I'm Kirk White. I represent Bethel, Rochester, Stockbridge, and Hancock, and I'm the ranking.
Monique Priestley, Bradford, Fairleigh, Westfield.
Michael Booton, Berry City.
Tony Nicholas, representing most of Milford and a little bit of Georgia.
Dave Bosch, representing Wallingford, Clarendon, West Rutland, and the bulk of Rutland Town.
Well, nice to meet all of you. Thank you for having me. Berry City myself. Nice to be here. So really excited to be here today. As I said, my name's Emma. I'm from Common Good Vermont, and we represent Vermont's nonprofit sector. And I'm really excited to be here to talk about Common Good Vermont's work, as well as Vermont's vital nonprofit sector. Despite it being rather challenging week for nonprofits and our communities across the state, nonprofits are really navigating uncertain times right now, with changes at the federal level that are really undermining our collective efforts and are going to be leading to and have led to funding cuts and program losses and layoffs at the same time as vital programs are under threat. So really making our social safety net more important now than ever. And so, as I said, Common Good serves Vermont nonprofit sector. We're a statewide program of United Way Northwest, so that relationship can be a little confusing, but we serve the entire state, that we're based in the Northwest. And our work falls into three main buckets. We do education, advocacy, and connection. And so educational trainings and resources for nonprofits is really at the heart of what we do. We serve as the go-to resource for professional development, best practices, and sector news and information. And this includes certificate programs. We have one in nonprofit management, as well as one in fundraising and development. And these are cohort-based programs where folks can connect with their peers and also build skills that help them advance their careers, run more efficient nonprofits, and resource their organizations. We also host all kinds of one-off webinars and other programs. We just hosted one on nonprofit audits. We have one coming up on re-energizing your board this month, or I guess next month, still in January. But this type of programming not only supports organizations, but it's also how we fund our organization primarily. We're a fee-for-service organization, and don't receive any public funding right now. We also have a really robust network of consultants that we work with. We have a nonprofit consultant directory, but we also have programming that supports them in their work, refer out to them and partner with them on trainings as well. And this is just such a core part of the nonprofit sector, since small staffs really rely on outsourcing some of that work and outside experts to help them move their work forward. And then finally, we're a clearinghouse for information, which is really enhanced by our partnership with the National Council of Nonprofits. We have a network of similar organizations in states across the country that we work on trainings and policy on. So really part of a bigger network as well. The second bucket is advocacy, and this is why I'm here today. So more than 6,400 nonprofits serve our state, and they employ 1 in 5 Vermont workers, which is actually up from the previous report, which was 1 in 7. So it's the second largest industry after state government. And while the sector is quite diverse, we really focus on issues impacting the entire sector. So workforce, charitable giving, grants and contracting, civic engagement, all of that is what we're working on. And I think what the important takeaway here is that the nonprofit sector is not only important to our community's well-being, but also an important part of our economy. Also under this bucket, Common Good fills a really important gap in nonprofit sector data. We host data.commongoodbt.org, which has visualizations of the IRS data breaking down our nonprofit sector. And we also conduct a biennial survey on nonprofit wages and benefits. We did one in 2024, and this helps organizations set wages and benefits that are competitive, but also the right size for their budget, and tells a really important story about the health and vitality of the nonprofit sector. And then finally, under the connection bucket, this is sort of how we describe our work around peer learning and partnership and unity within the sector. And this has been an area of growth for us the past year. We went on a listening tour this fall. We visited Brattleboro and Rutland and St. Johnsbury and Johnson and heard from all types of organizations. And on the tour, we heard housing and healthcare costs and community safety and funding levels and practices are really some of the key challenges that organizations are navigating right now. We also hosted the first nonprofit statewide summit this year here in Montpelier. We had over 200 folks from the nonprofit community come together for learning and connection, and we're looking forward to growing the event this year. In January, we launched a membership program. We were not previously a membership program, but we are already over 82 members strong and growing. And this is one way that we're hoping to support peer-to-peer connection while also supporting the capacity of member organizations. And then finally, another example of this is we just hosted a convening for nonprofits around community safety. We had over 150 people register and 75 show up to really dive into how community safety issues are impacting nonprofits as both employers and community service providers. So I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And so that's really what we do. And I want to talk a little bit about Vermont's nonprofit sector. As I mentioned, there's more than 6,400 nonprofits in our state, and this includes all different types of nonprofits, 30 different classifications. But usually what we're talking about is 501c3s or public charities and private foundations. And so public charities really address everything from basic needs like food, shelter, childcare, health services, education. They also provide vibrancy to our villages and towns through investment in the arts and historic recreation and economic development. And these organizations also must be nonpartisan, so they're dedicated to serving the common good. And these are just a few examples of how you may have engaged with a nonprofit in your life. And then the next few slides are pulled from our nonprofit data site. There's visualizations of IRS data, and this chart shows the breakdown of Vermont's nonprofit sector by type. So you can see about 4,500 public charities. This shows nonprofits by revenue. So you can see a lot of them are really small, having either none or under 50,000 in revenue annually. So we have a lot of nonprofits, but most of them are very small and volunteer run. And then this is how they're dispersed by county. So you can see how many are serving your area. Clearly there's more in Chittenden County and Washington County, whereas there's fewer in rural areas, which sort of shows how resources are dispersed. And I also want to just make the point that nonprofit is a tax status. It's not a business model. And so this shows the breakdown of revenue nationally for the nonprofit sector. But depending on the size or the mission area of a nonprofit, their revenue streams and operations may look very different. Smaller organizations tend to rely more on private grants or individual giving, while larger ones are the ones that are fee-for-service or receive government funding or larger grants and gifts. And so as you can see, a lot of the sector's overall revenue comes from government grants and contracts. In our recent wages and benefits report, we found that 53% of participating Vermont organizations reported receiving federal funding. And that typically accounted for about a quarter of their total revenue on average. And so in light of federal actions, this just gives a sense of the potential funding gap we may see if there's a pause or other funding halts. And then finally, I want to emphasize the value of nonprofits as economic engines. The nonprofit sector is the second largest industry after state government. As I said, 1 in 5 Vermont workers, and they pay over $3 billion in wages that support our tax base and are reinvested in local economies. So a sector this large also purchases goods and services that generate economic activity. And they also provide services and opportunities that bring people to our communities to live, work, and play, whether it's outdoor recreation or arts or a hospital. And this also has a ripple effect on local businesses and attracts new employers. And finally, nonprofits support workforce participation by providing training, job placement services, childcare, so folks could re-enter the workforce, and other support services. And so given the role that nonprofits play in our communities, it's really critical that we support and invest in their success and that of nonprofit workers. So this year, grant and contract reform, workforce support, and community safety have been identified as some of our primary and critical needs for the sector. And so relevant to your committee, workforce is a big issue for us. And we know housing and healthcare are not unique pressures to the nonprofit sector, but I included some insights here from our wages and benefits report to underscore the extent of their impact on the nonprofit sector. 94% of organizations participating in the wages and benefits report this year said their healthcare costs went up. It was only like 53% the previous survey, so that's a lot more. And similarly, housing was identified as the second biggest barrier to recruiting and retaining employees in the state. And that was higher than the New England average and in years past. And then finally, workforce development. I also want to touch just fair funding. A lot of organizations with state grants and contracts, direct service workers have a hard time recruiting and retaining employees just because they have struggled to offer competitive wages and benefits. And then finally, workforce development. This year on the list of most promising jobs, which I saw you had some brochures of in the corner, there are several nonprofit jobs on that list, including social workers, which require graduate degrees, yet often don't really offer compensation that's commensurate with the demands of that job and the educational requirements. And so I think organizations working for Vermonters on behalf of the state really need to be able to pay enough to keep folks in this field, as well as attract new folks into it. Other jobs like training and development specialists and fundraising, which I think is new this year, are areas where Common Good is well equipped to develop new talent, offering certificate programs in both of these areas. And fundraising is also a really challenging and isolating job, yet it's really necessary to bring the resources we need to keep our organizations running. And so our program participants benefit from a network of their peers in those programs. And I actually just had someone reach out who was hoping to relocate here and saw them as a way to integrate into Vermont's philanthropic community, which I thought was great. And there's also a need for accountants and auditors serving our nonprofits. Many folks outsource this and they can't even find firms that can take them on at this time. So just highlighting that. And then I just wanted to highlight that there are so many vital fields within the nonprofit sector that are critical to Vermont's health, safety, and economy, such as recovery and substance use services, economic development, and child care providers. We've worked with a lot of these folks. They come through our programs, and we know the unique challenges they face and the value of their work. So just highlighting as an area to make sure we're supporting. Almost to the end. And so this doesn't really fall into your committee purview, but it does relate to workforce. soon to be introduced legislation seeks to address some of the grant and contracting challenges nonprofits with state grants and contracts are experiencing. Many organizations providing services on behalf of the state report that they can't recruit and retain skilled workers due to funding that's unpredictable year to year, doesn't cover annual wage increases, or isn't sufficient to offer competitive wages and benefits. So this bill would create a working group that would look at funding, but also other systems and processes at the administrative level to make it more viable, predictable, and efficient. Also, with recent policy actions at the federal level, that's really jeopardizing the work and funding of nonprofits in our communities. It's so important that we strengthen government nonprofit partnerships at the state level at this time. So we'd greatly appreciate your support of this bill when it's released. And sort of building on the past couple issues I've talked about, workforce and grants and contracts. Common Good, as I mentioned, serves a similar role to the nonprofit sector as the SBA does for businesses, but without public support. And so we are seeking state funding to fill a gap in technical assistance, workforce development, and grant and contract support for the sector that would create efficiencies both for nonprofits and for the state. And these funds would be invested to provide capacity to nonprofits that have grants and contracts through the state of Vermont. And with this funding, we can expand our current offerings to support emerging sector needs, to grow equitable access to programming, and in partnership with the state, increase the impact and efficiency of public investments. And we know funding resources are really limited right now, but we do see this as a way to strengthen the sector at a time where it's really needed. And we're not sure if this is something the committee can help with, but we really appreciate your consideration and any recommendations or feedback you have. And this is the last issue. Top of mind for sectors and communities across our state is the issue of safety. I mentioned we held the safety convening earlier this month, and these are some of the insights we gleaned. Our op-ed is actually just published this morning in BT Digger if you want to learn more. Nonprofits are both employers and service providers, and nonprofits are really on the front line of this work, and they need the resources and support to make sure that they're protecting the safety of both their staff, their guests, their clients. Many have reported in a survey we put out that they're spending thousands to hundreds of thousands on security measures, which is taking away resources from their core work. And they're ready to work collaboratively towards solutions, solving these challenges, hoping to center equity and compassion as well as accountability. I just wanted to highlight that. And that's really what I wanted to share with you today. I really appreciate you having me in and listening, and look forward to working with you to strengthen your nonprofit workforce. And if you need any more information or have any questions, I'm happy to answer.
Thank you, Emma. Questions? John?
Something that I observed in the sort of time to the workforce and seeing that about maybe 1/5 of your 501 of the nonprofits are not C3s, maybe C6s or C4s, thus making them ineligible for the public service loan forgiveness program. Have you heard PSLF used as a useful tool in recruitment or retention or in any way around the workforce?
I think it's definitely a factor that goes into folks considering a nonprofit career. I know it factored into my own personal decision to work for a nonprofit. And at the national level, I think that is something our partners at the National Council has really been focusing on, but I haven't heard a ton of folks that have used that specifically as a selling point to join the workforce. That's a great thought.
Okay, I noticed in my own survey of nonprofit activity within my region, it doesn't seem to come up in any of the materials, and I sort of wondered if that was something that was maybe not understood as well as it could be.
I think we do see a lot of turnover in the sector and a lot of folks that wind up leaving for the
10
private
years.
or government, and 10 years is just a long time to be at that salary level. Yeah,
Thank you.
appreciate it.
Two questions, and thanks for your testimony. You mentioned, I think, a budget request amount. Do you have a current line item in the budget or not?
No, this is a new proposal. We're sort of shopping it around.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah.
I just didn't know the status of prior.
I appreciate it.
And you mentioned state grant and contract reform.
Mhm.
I think that's a great issue, especially compared to the federal process. And I was just wondering what the status of that initiative was and whether there was anything specific you were asking the legislature.
Yeah, so there is a bill, it's still in Ledge Council.
Okay.
Soon to be released. I understand there's quite a backlog right now. But it'll be similar to H-140 last year. And that made it all the way through the House and Senate and wound up in appropriations at the end of the session. But it's similar, it would create a working group to look at a bunch of different issues, including funding levels, reimbursement processes, indirect rates, and late payments.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
So you mentioned about the fair funding issue. Do you do any donor education? Because I know I've worked with nonprofits for 10 years and it's always fun to have the conversation about the actual material needs of your staff and your, ongoing overhead versus the actual program work. Are you able to help kind of dive into that dialogue and work with donors on education?
I think that's something we'd love to do a lot more of. We're actually being a program of United Way Northwest, I think positions us really well to do so, as they are both a organization that receives funds, but also is a granting organization. And I think they do a really good model of offering flexible funding that's fair. And there's, I'm blanking on their name right now, but there's a great national organization that does advocacy with funders around that. But I think they're definitely, especially right now, as the private funding will be so much more important. Room for more of that, for sure.
I'm just curious. I know one thing, like at my nonprofit, that I ran into a lot was like costs of like ASL, and I know other orgs running into like language interpretation fees or trainings, like offering like how to work with like neurodiverse populations and things like that. I'm just curious, like if you're tracking the costs of that or the requests from nonprofits, or if they're even bothering asking because like even like a 2-hour session might be like $750 in ASL fees, which, and you want to support that. And in a lot of cases, if your org is big enough, you have to support that. So I'm just curious if that goes into costs that you're hearing about.
I haven't heard a lot about the costs. I think there's definitely been, I know the Arts Council has been doing some really great education around that.
Yeah.
But it is a barrier for sure that I think that we have room to improve on as well. And we actually just hosted a workshop with Mel Hauser from All Brains Belong with neurodiversity. She's fabulous and has really influenced our own practices. And I think a lot of certain things you could do really low cost and they're not big barriers. It's just being flexible. But then, yes, there is the cost of translators and ASL. But that would be really interesting. For sure.
I have a question about scale. So there's, looking at the charts, there's 6,400 nonprofits in Vermont. 3,700 of them have less than $50,000 in revenue, and another 700 have less than 100. So it's kind of a minority that I would call like, I'm not sure what the right word to use, but like those small scales are more like, it's like, it'd be like somebody's side hobby, nonprofit hobby kind of, right? If you only have under $50,000 in revenue, that's, I'm not saying, it's somebody's passion, right? But so I guess I'm trying to get to, we have a lot of nonprofits, and is there talk about, and just in Burlington, we had 3 separate nonprofits that serviced, for after school programs and youth. And now we have 2 because one of them went under. I think there's a lot of nonprofits that are struggling, and I'm just wondering if there's talk about consolidation, or I don't know what my question is exactly. Just that I know that's just a lot of very, very small organizations, and how does one support those so that means you have accounting systems for 6,400 separate organizations. So I'm not sure what the question is, except There's a
Yeah.
lot of very small nonprofits.
There are lots of really small nonprofits, and I think a lot of those are volunteer run and maybe a little more niche, maybe locally focused, your community food shelf, who oftentimes are working directly with the food bank or others. But I think overall, there has been some trends of looking to collaboration and partnership as a way to become more efficient. I know the area associations, area agencies on aging have a really great model that they've been just recently implementing, where they're sharing administrative services, but they're still all operating independently, because I think there is that tension still where folks want to be connected to their local communities. They want to have local control, but they also, sometimes folks are in an organization because they're passionate, not because they want to run a business.
Yeah.
So I think we have been doing more education around that, focusing on the benefits of fiscal sponsorship, of running a program of another organization rather than starting one of your own. So there's a less duplication and redundancy.
Thank you.
Yeah. Answered.
You did, yeah.
So, yeah, no, I was actually gonna push on that a little bit, because I think that's incredibly important in a state this size. And I'm curious what kind of, it's the wrong word, but I'm gonna use it, support groups, or, ways that you allow, could you, or do you set up space for groups that are either working in the same industry or area, or different ways that you could put people together, right? To figure out where they can gain efficiency. Like, is that a focus of yours, or is that not something that really has been done yet?
Yeah, that's actually something we've been trying to do a lot more of at our nonprofit summit this fall. We had peer breakout groups. So organizations met with other folks in similar roles. We also are starting an executive director roundtable for our members, where they can collaborate and share ideas and learn together. And I think a lot of our membership program is focused on sort of building those senses of community and offering more opportunities for folks just to connect and identify where there's, partnership opportunities and alignment. Same on our listening tour. That was not just for us to listen, but also for them to listen to each other. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I came up through the nonprofit world, and I think that I know that nonprofits do a tremendous amount of good in our communities, but I also know that often the folks who start nonprofits are starting it because it's a passion of theirs, and it may not be the need of the community or the most vital need, right? And I'm just trying to figure out, how do we, I don't want to stifle anybody's growth, but I do want to help us to get the most support for the community that is necessary, right? So I'm trying to balance that, right? What's our role here, and how do we?
Yeah, and I think to that point, to some degree, like, these things sort of sort themselves if there's not a lot of interest in funding that particular nonprofit or volunteering. These things sort of peter out. But when we're talking about supporting the sector and nonprofit workforce, we're usually talking about the larger organizations that have substantial staff and have been established for a long time, and its history of running successful programs.
Just, and my first
Go ahead, Abby.
I was just gonna double up on the fiscal sponsorship comment, and that, my concern with really small organizations, so it's like, what are the financial controls? And so we know that, so anyway, that's just, I think fiscal, so maybe there's a way to help encourage and support organizations to have fiscal sponsors. I think it builds in more financial controls.
Yeah, we definitely recommend it whenever folks reach out to us. We're like, have you explored fiscal sponsorship? Here's some resources.
Great.
And I think also, board governance structures also do offer, when the board is well functioning, that sort of support as well.
Yeah, for sure.
I guess to carry on this conversation with the fiscal sponsorship piece of it, some of the larger organizations, the fiscal sponsor organizations I've worked with, have complained often about dealing with some of the smaller or organizations costing them a lot in terms of resources on their end. Are you all finding that? And do you have, if so, are you thinking about plans on how to help ease that overall?
Yeah, so I think on the one hand, if there's really strong program alignment, which oftentimes when an organization takes on a fiscal sponsor, there is, so they're also vested in that project and almost take it on as their own. But in other cases, it is more of a transactional, you do my admin and process our payments, whereas you are sort of independent as well. But there are a lot of organizations out there, like the Tiny Seed Project, that their mission is to be a fiscal sponsor. So we often send folks that way. So that,
And I guess I'm also asking for you all as an organization, are you finding that offering technical support and all of this for the organizations that are under 50,000, is that costing you a lot in your administration costs and that sort of thing? Compared to your larger donor or your larger organizations, I mean.
we haven't personally been a fiscal sponsor for an
Oh,
organization.
not just fiscal sponsor, I just mean your actual organizational administration.
I could definitely see that, proportionally it could be a larger spend. I think in the way we interact with them, not so much, but I imagine there is some inefficiency to that. Yeah.
Something that Ben Doyle had referred to, and I think in meeting here, was with respect to the Village Trust Initiative, what I think you called the nonprofit industrial complex, as like we have this model for how we're going to bring these, birth these very small, very specifically focused sort of nonprofits to trusts that will administer key public assets, community assets, I should say. That had me thinking, and we looked at it from a geographic distribution for, but can you speak to any trends in terms of the number of new firms, new nonprofit registrations? Are you seeing an acceleration, a deceleration? Is it, and what I'm really sort of getting at is if we control for size, that there's perfectly healthy and very successful entities at a really small budget because they know what they're there for and people are with it or whatever it is. But are you seeing more and more entrants? Has it been steady? Is it becoming a bigger piece of the pie than it was 10 years ago?
That's an interesting question. I know during COVID, we did see a lot of new organizations form. I think there was a lot of efforts around community health equity, and a lot of federal funding opportunities where maybe small grassroots organizations stepped up and actually took on like large grants. And we did see a little bit of challenge there with the sustainability issue in the long term. But I haven't really looked in the past year or two what that has sort of leveled off to. But I think based on just like looking at our charts over and over, I think it's been pretty steady for the past couple of years at least.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Looking to talk. Dave and then.
The smaller size ones, do they tend to be in the more rural areas or are they equally distributed throughout the state? Or more focused in the more urban areas? What's your sense of that?
That's a good question. I think the organizations in more rural areas do tend to be smaller on average, just given that they're serving a smaller population. Right. I think there are a lot of small community-based organizations in the more urban areas as well, though. So I wouldn't say that there are more like super tiny in one area or the other, but I think on average, rural areas tend to be smaller. I could look into that.
Do you offer a list of like grants and contract opportunities for your members?
Yes, we do have a funding piece of our weekly newsletter where we share all current and reoccurring grants that are on our radar. Obviously, we don't have the federal or state doesn't have a federal state grant database. And one of the things we're hoping to address through this bill actually is having all state funding opportunities in one place. That was one of our goals originally, as John. But yeah, so we do have a list in our newsletter and share them regularly, and that's usually a really popular source of folks.
It's not like like referenceable on your website.
We actually are planning to move it there, but we don't have a, just because they change so frequently, with the grant cycles, but that's a good thing.
Question? Could you speak to, so the change that was made in unemployment, and how you worked with Department of Labor and how that went? Just so everybody knows, during the pandemic, we found, I think we realized or found out that nonprofits that had under 4 employees could exempt themselves from unemployment. And so what happened was that there were some people that were working for nonprofits that were then released from work because of the pandemic. But then they had no income coming in because they couldn't collect unemployment. And so I think we had a lot of discussions over a few years and decided that everyone should be paying into either become a reimbursable employer, which most nonprofits elect to be, which means that they don't pay into the fund, but if they have an employee that they lay off and that loses their job through no fault of their own, is eligible for unemployment, and the nonprofit would pay dollar for dollar for what that employee receives. And so we decided that everyone should be in on, should be paying in or be a reimbursable employer. So we removed the exemption, but we extended the effective date out a year so that it would give Common Good and the Department of Labor enough time to actually let those nonprofits know what changes we made so that they wouldn't get less likely to be afoul of the law. So yes.
Yeah, so I worked really closely with the Department of Labor team. We developed a really extensive guide around unemployment insurance for nonprofit and municipal employers. That's now evergreen material on both of our websites. We hosted a webinar in partnership with them last spring now, and it was really well attended, and that's also evergreen content that we have available. I did connect with Rowan last week, and it seems like they had around 500, I think, nonprofits registered so far that were determined to be liable, and newly registered since the July 1 effective date. But there's still, and I'm not quite sure on the numbers I got from her, but it seems like there's still a significant number that still need a response or still need to make contact with. So we're in conversations about doing some more outreach to those organizations. But I do think things have stabilized some since the pandemic, and organizations are more cognizant of the impact of UI, and, you know, should they be paying state taxes, or are they setting aside funds for being a reimbursable employer?
I think it wasn't just relegated to small employers, it was larger nonprofit employers as well, that all of a sudden, you know, they had to lay off their entire staff, and then they're getting hit with these huge bills because they're reimbursable. And you know, federal government provided dollars, I think, to help pay for 50% of what the nonprofits paid in unemployment. But of course, there was a payroll protection program too, that helped keep people on the employer's roles and payroll. And so, but it was an eye opener, I think, for everybody that were choosing to be reimbursable of just how much exposure they have.
Just to kind of shift us, I was curious, of the Vermont nonprofits, how many does your organization serve?
So I think it's a little hard to quantify just because we have so many different ways and with many different touch points we have with them through our educational programming, our webinars, advocacy work. our jobs board. Our newsletter has 3,400 subscribers to it. That gives a sense, but we typically work more with small to mid-size organizations and sort of partner more with some of the larger ones.
If you could, is it possible to get those numbers just to,
Is there a specific?
I'm curious about both totals and by program, if it's possible.
Yeah, we are in midst of a database transition right now, and all of our data is in Excel files, but yes, I will pull that together, yeah. But yeah, it's making it.
Dentist.
That's terrifying.
Yeah.
Other questions? Thank you very much.
Thank you all so much. Really appreciated the conversation, follow up with that information. Thank you. Thank you.
Our next presenter will be on at 11:15, so I think we'll take a 25-minute break, so let's be here promptly at 11:15. Otherwise, if we start late, then that cuts into your lunch hour. So